Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile, Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
Thank you, Ray Hobbs, my esteemed producer. And yes, it is Meanwhile Here on Earth with a rather special episode tonight. Namely, we are celebrating or marking an anniversary, 77 years since a businessman and private pilot named Kenneth Arnold was piloting his plane in the Cascade Mountain Range and encountered a number of craft he was completely unfamiliar with, going at speeds that he considered impossible. The sighting report that he made upon landing not only changed his life, but in a very real sense, all of our lives as well. To mark this anniversary, I've invited a dear friend and repeat visitor here on Meanwhile Here on Earth, Donald R. Schmitt, who is the former co-director of the J.Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies in Chicago, where he served as director of special investigations for 10 years. Prior to that, Don was special investigator for Dr. Hynek, a 7-time best-selling author. His first book, UFO Crash at Roswell, was made into the Golden Globe-nominated film Roswell, and his book, Witness to Roswell, was the #1 best-selling UFO book in the world for 2 straight years, and with good cause. He is also chief investigator of the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell, New Mexico. We'll be discussing on this episode Kenneth Arnold, the man who had the experience, the reality and the implications of that sighting, and, well, the so-called modern age of UFOs that it launched, and where we now stand looking back with some perspective through kind of a time tunnel of 77 years. We'll be talking about more as well. Donald Schmitt, welcome back to Meanwhile Here on Earth, my friend.
Well, wonderful to be back with you, Peter. Always great to be with you. Thank you.
You're most welcome. And I don't know, you may have been a guest on the show at least half a dozen times, but this is the first time we're speaking where by chance in one actual linear week, we will be seeing each other, and not surprisingly, in Roswell, New Mexico.
Of all places, who would have predicted? So,
of all the gin joints in all the cities, exactly.
Let's hope it cools down a little bit. I was out there 2 weeks ago, and it was averaging around 110 each day. A little early.
Yeah. Okay, then. Thankfully, our workplace is air conditioned, and Roswell, I guess, if the modern age of UFOs officially kicked in, it was with a 2-beat symphony.
Yes.
The first was 77 years ago today with Kenneth Arnold, and the next was literally less than a week later. And
Correct.
Those 2 events started things off. I thought, to begin with, just for us to take a quick look at a few pieces of news media that were generated. This is one of the earliest reports. It would have been written on the 2nd of July and published on the 3rd in the New York Times. And as you know better than almost anybody, Don, the media kind of went batshit crazy that summer and inundated us with the most extraordinary collection of condescending, sarcastic, innuendo-ridden, extremely pedantic dismissals that no matter what it wasn't what some people thought it was. The flying discs failed to stir the Air Force. Again, this would have been written probably on the 2nd, published on the 3rd.
I'm going to throw something out at you, Peter.
Yeah.
That I really haven't discussed with anyone else.
Please.
Beyond, because we certainly remember the impact, or at least what we were led to believe was the reaction, the overreaction to the H.G. Wells adaptation by Orson Welles of the War of the Worlds broadcast.
Highly exaggerated.
Just 9 years before. 9 years before. And when we both know that for all of the written accounts of the panic in the streets and people jumping out of windows, no less, and that people, just, believe this to be a genuine invasion of planet Earth by, invaders from Mars, no less. And to then, as we are both students of history, to discover,
fool me once.
Yeah. And to discover that all of this was within the printed media. These accounts of this panic situation. And to learn that, especially the newspapers, this was their way of essentially, because this was a radio broadcast. These were the upstarts. These were the new people on the media block. And it was the way for the newspapers to essentially put them back in their place. Embellish and sensationalize a situation that, as we certainly all know, that Orson Welles, and there was a disclaimer throughout. I mean, they just constantly reminded the listeners that this was a radio dramatization, but it was a way for the newspapers to stick it to the radio broadcasters. Now, let's jump 9 years. And now that we started out with the Arnold sighting and the fact, as we both know, that the newspapers had a field day. That
Flying saucer. What an unfortunate choice of words.
Precisely. And the commercial aspects and the cartoonists of the time, and as far as the hoaxes that were being generated as a result of flying saucer, that type of thing. But the media, again, the newspapers had a field day. And so now that I'm thinking about this, I'm wondering if this was a continuation on that same stick it to the radio. And then in 47, also the new television broadcasters. And that it was primarily the newspapers that were attacking and smearing the witnesses at that time. So I think it's a study in psychology that I might look into. The idea that we already know that was the case in 38. But I now, in looking at this, I'm wondering if it was just a continuation of that same theme, that it was more it wasn't political as much as it was just competition. The idea that we're going to make sure that if anybody has anything to say, anything to see regarding this subject, they're going to come to us.
Yes. Broadcast media can't be trusted.
Can't be trusted. Precisely. And,
you're talking and my mind is spinning like a little top. If anybody watching or listening has never actually listened to that October 30th, 1938 broadcast of Mercury Theater of the Air, brilliant
Halloween Eve, right.
It's a more innocent time. What they've done is taken a novel published in 1899 by the great H.G. Wells, Americanized it, updated it, and broadcast it,
Like a
a
live
week
event.
after,
Like a
but
live event. Yeah.
and at the same time, what was in the background in many Americans' minds was a week or so before, if I'm off, it's not by much, the Germans rolled into Poland. War had just been declared in Europe, and there was a great deal of anxiety and tension about. We were primed,
Yes.
and it's a brilliant play, and at the same time, it was played. While you were speaking, I downloaded a few extra images, all of them by chance from 1952, a big year. This was from, I think, the Chicago Tribune. In the vapor trail, the limitless spaces of fancy. What a lovely turn of a phrase. Not easy to shoot down, of course. Good old Uncle Sam going at it. And
Right.
this one.
I did too see a flying ball. Flying ball. Okay. Well,
Who's going to believe them?
I know.
And then a classic. Yes, we're talking about the cost of living, but let's keep this in your mind. This is such superb. I won't even call it propaganda. It's just, it plays on the imagination and keeps that subject front and center. And in 1947, in the summer, let's think about where we were for a moment as a country. We were, in some ways, the country many of us wish we were now. We had played a major role in defeating fascism in Europe. We had done something, I don't know if it had ever been attempted in history, where we put billions of our own money on the line through an inspired program called the Marshall Program. And much to the horror first of many Americans, we invested in the rebuilding of our two greatest enemies.
Europe. Yes.
And to making sure they established constitutions that would allow them to grow democratically.
Correct.
Thinking now, the major military threat the Japanese and the Germans have posed all these decades since the end of the war kind of speaks for itself. And whatever ups and downs, they have been good citizens of the world overall.
Yes.
It was the summer, and it happened officially on July 1st, that the very distinguished publication, still a monthly and still very widely read by those in the know, Foreign Affairs, published a paper by a then up-and-coming political scientist called On Containment, and he used the pseudonym of X. And he laid out a policy by which the Soviet Union, who everybody knew by then was our next enemy, glaring us in the face, Joe Stalin and his communist minions, that there was a possibility so soon after the end of World War II, we would go roaring into another war. And it was George Kennan, who went on to become advisor, I think, to 9 or 10 American presidents. He lived to be like 102, who laid forward a policy that the Truman administration picked up on. He said, if we can contain the Soviets within the borders that they had expanded to at the end of the war and hold them, we could avoid a hot war or a shooting war and instead have a non-shooting or a Cold War. The Cold War and the modern age of UFOs were born at the same moment in time. I believe this is very much a coincidence in a very real way. It's just, I'm sure there are people that would love to weave them together in a grand conspiracy. It's just the way it went down. But that summer, well, you know, I mean, the 1947 project is there a more interesting year in the 20th century with more history that we weren't supposed to know about than any other year imaginable. If you had to study 1 year in the 20th century for the rest of your life, that would be one that could keep you very busy day by day and hour by hour.
Yes. Because first of all, you have the splitting off as far as between the Army Air Corps and the Air Force. You had the actual
National Security Act,
the Security
CIA,
Act, creation of the CIA. I mean, all in 47, and it's just post World War II, as you were describing, and the military is walking on water. They are, the heroes of the world as far as they were all supermen back at that time. But we also forget is that there was a large faction within the Pentagon during World War II that was hoping that Nazi Germany would eliminate the Soviet Union, would take them out.
Of course.
That they
And
would
why not?
thoroughly, defeat them. And then, certainly by all the FBI documents that have since been recovered, that after as many of the Nazis,
Operation Paperclip.
Well, Paperclip coming here, but then also for all the ones that fled to South America. And we fully knew they were there. And we were working with them because they were providing us with intelligence that we were then using against the Soviet
They had
Union.
the best intelligence network in Europe. It was worth something to us.
You had General Kurt LeMay, that with the success of the atomic bomb, that they were strongly encouraging, as far as Pentagon officials, that we need to go into Russia now. We need to, we have this bomb. Let's eliminate the Soviets once and for all. So, yes. And so you had all that even going on behind the scenes. And so much of this was not in the media because, again, we were riding high on that wave of victory. And the last thing that anyone anticipated was that someone else may be watching. That someone else would be taking note, and then
that's almost a line right out of
War of the Worlds.
War of the Worlds, that somebody else was watching and somebody else is watching. You've kind of set it up for me to bring us back into a macrocosm that summer. America was, getting on with things, returning to work, opportunities for GIs. They were making their own families.
They were able to take out mortgages that were backed up by the federal government. And everything was looking bright.
And
in the future.
We look at the differences between, say, Truman and Dewey coming into 1948. Politics was a rough game, not as rough as it is now. And with all of this as a backdrop, that summer, I guess it was in Boise, a businessman, a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold, a family man. One of my favorite photos of him from the family.
Yes, yeah, and that's a nice color shot, which you
normally see. And that's not colorized; that is color.
That is color, right?
But at the time, the backstory was a plane had gone down in the Cascade Mountain Range, and civil air patrols and the like were out there looking.
Plane. Correct, right.
And Arnold was on a business trip, and he observed, this now legendary group of craft, reported it, and the fact was, when he landed, because reporters and media were waiting for news on this downed plane, there were reporters. And that story went out on the wire services all over the country, and then within a day, all over the world. And we can think of people in history who, simply by being where they were at the moment they were, have brought tremendous attention to themselves, and much of it unwanted. You think of Abraham Zapruder, who happened to simply be working with his 8mm camera in Dallas that horrible day.
Dealey Plaza, Kennedy assassination.
And, other individuals who become part of an important moment in history without ever asking. He lands at the air. Yeah.
You mentioned an interesting thing that here's Arnold, who had thousands of hours in the air.
Yep.
And much of it due to the fact that he was a businessman and that he would fly his work route, as far as via plane. And that there was a $5,000 reward being offered for anyone, who would find this downed military plane. So that's a year's income, more than a year's income back then. And so he just would have returned home in Boise, but he spent an hour as part of the search effort. So he would not have been anywhere near this particular mountain range between Mount Adams and Mount Rainier, where he could be an observer of something so extraordinary. As I like the way Dr. Bruce Maccabee put it that it was almost miraculous that he happened to be at that very location when he was. And
But he was.
And he was. And it would become the birth of, as you call it, the birth, of a contemporary ufology. I mean, it's where that summer it just took off.
Everything began.
Everything began. And the newspapers again, the banner headlines for 2 solid weeks, you would have thought we were being invaded. And the wonderful thing, and I've seen this myself for being in small planes on a regular basis through the years. And one of the things that you are constantly, depending on the size of the aircraft, if you're in a single engine, you're moving slower. You're moving at a third or half the speed of twin engine aircraft. And so you're always on the lookout. And the difference, and then if you're in the opposite, that you come up out of a cloud bank, and there it's like they're shooting backwards towards you because they're flying at half your speed, and how you have to quickly maneuver to avoid collision. Yeah. And so the one thing that typically catches your eye is a flash. And when you fly, your immediate reaction is another aircraft. And this was a flash that immediately drew Arnold's attention. It was so bright that it lit up his cockpit.
Amazing.
And then as he quickly, scanned the sky from south to east, and that's when he saw these 9 objects. And the fact that they were not reflecting sunlight, the fact that they were giving, or one of them gave off a flash of light from the distance he was, that it lit up his cockpit. So that just began what, we all, us students of the history of UFOs, and the fact that by everything he described, and as a trained pilot, that he was able to use his dash clock, and knowing the distance from Mount Adams, Mount Rainier is about 50 miles.
He could clock.
Like it was just over a minute and a half. And that came out to over 1,700 miles an hour. And at that time, that's 1,000 miles an hour faster than anything, even a jet aircraft back at that time.
That's right. Yeah. This is a very highly stylized illustration.
Yes.
But to give an idea of, the shape, of course.
The one being crescent shaped and the other 8 being more of a heel of a shoe. Correct. Yeah. But still circular. And a lot of people would assume, or they have assumed, that it was because Arnold said they were disc shaped. Well, we both know that when he had landed, and as you had mentioned, the press, and like it was reporter Bill Bichette at the Oregonian newspaper, who then, as Arnold would describe the maneuverability, that there was a bit of a wobble, but that it was like a saucer skipping across the water.
Bingo. And he's the man who
came up with the very term, flying saucer. Flying saucer.
The ultimate expression, if a saucer, why not a cup?
Why not a cup? I know.
It's the built-in ability to make anybody look silly that took the subject seriously. You're underscoring the fact that this was not only an experienced pilot, this was a highly experienced pilot. And, well,
he was in the air every week. That was his job. That was his work. And so, and this was his territory.
Yes.
It wasn't, as skeptics have suggested, it wasn't 9 meteors. It wasn't 9 pelicans, as others have suggested. It wasn't 9 conventional aircraft, because as much as Arnold, again, as an experienced pilot, tried to discern a fuselage, wings, a tail, engines, anything. These objects were devoid of our technology at that time.
Yeah.
And that's the wonderful thing about this event, and then tying up to Roswell. The skies are still pristine. I hear things today and I'm yawning. It's like, I long for the days of the past when there were only two possibilities. It was something top secret, or it was someone else's aircraft. And rocketry, jet propulsion, they were in their infancy at that time. As I'd mentioned, fastest aircraft we had at that time was approaching the speed of sound. And anything beyond that, it was clearly something that defied conventional explanation. And that is why, to this day, the skeptics are still trying to explain away the Arnold sightings, because up to today, they have failed. It just does not scientifically match as far as the descriptions, the facts involved. And I would challenge, I would point this out. How many of these skeptics are pilots? How many of them have the experience that would rival Arnold at that time, and that they could even speak from a position of authority? They can't. They're sitting at their keyboards and they're coming up with explanations that are even more unbelievable than the fact that we were dealing with a new technology.
Doesn't it seem ironic to you in a way, considering where the field was 30, 40 years ago, that here we are now with the extraterrestrial hypothesis being considered by many so passé and so not of interest, when you've got so many UAPs. We're talking phenomena rather than objects here, and all the ether and all the possibilities. Keep your mind nice and busy while you're not looking at what you should be looking at.
Right.
Again, to underscore the conditioning, because I don't think anybody in media or government could have predicted the incredible success involved in the repetition of what amounted to lies. I mean, it's an old standard way of turning populations. If you just keep hammering away with something that's untrue, and you say it in a venue that's somewhat respected, or you say it using proper grammar, or you just keep saying it, people will believe it. And it would be funny if it wasn't so incredibly insulting and outrageous, some of what they pulled. What I'm about to just read to you from is from a piece that appeared in the Times. I think it was their very first UFO-related editorial, meaning it was the first weekend after, probably the first Sunday issue. So maybe it's 4 or 5 days after the event. Those annual sea serpents have been taking a much-needed rest along our coast this summer. But while Old Reliable has been lying low, those sky-skimming saucers have been flying high. Their natural habitat appears to be the Pacific Northwest, but they have now been observed, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, from California to Nova Scotia. For weeks, the incredible discs have been zooming across the horizon at 3 times the rate of sound. Lovely provincial phrases, and that is fast going on anybody's speedometer. The next day, San Francisco, planes hunt in vain, of course, for this event, and failed to search. So, well, we could go away and hammer it to death, but
that's again historically. In tying this, the ridicule factor implies, even with Roswell, that one of the main arbiters of the cover-up at Roswell, and who staged the infamous weather balloon press conference, where only one reporter is allowed into the room to take pictures of the substituted weather balloon device, and that was General Roger Ramey, head of the 8th Air Force. So he was the commanding officer over the 509th Bomb Wing, which was the first atomic bomb squadron in the world. So the base commander at Roswell, Colonel William Blanchard, he would answer to General Ramey, who was pictured there. Now, Ramey, within a couple of days after the media, again, fully accepted the balloon explanation for Roswell, was doing an interview in an El Paso radio station. And the host of the program just brings, just proposed the thought, well, General, that explains Roswell, but isn't it true that such objects are being sighted in every state throughout America? To which General Ramey responded, well, that's true, except for Kansas, which is a dry state. So
yuck.
Yeah, yuck. So, he thought on that one real long. And
I didn't know that one.
And so you can demonstrate the level of smear tactics and character assassination. And so they were going to, make it almost reach a level of insurmountable distress before someone would risk life, limb, and reputation by reporting such a thing. Exactly. Once the government got through with this topic. And then we tie in the fact that immediately after Roswell, the Army Air Corps went into a very highly systematic demonstration at military bases all around the country, demonstrating that when you launch these weather balloons with these radar reflector kites, and that the balloons alone, that when they reach a certain altitude, that because of the pressure, the air pressure, that it can make the balloon appear elliptical. And as a result, it obviously doesn't have a tail or wings, no engine. And so it's reflecting the sunlight. And my God, there's one of those flying saucers. There's a flying disc. But what no one in the media ever questioned the fact is, yes, but Roswell was on the ground in front of you. You could hold it in your hands. It's one thing and we've seen things that look strange at a certain distance, at a certain altitude. It's altogether different when it's on the ground, right before your eyes. But this was their attempt to explain away the Kenneth Arnold and all the other sightings of the flying saucers during that summer. So if they got away with it with Roswell, let's make an effort to do the same with all the other reports. And it worked.
And again, to underscore that, the brazenness of the pose that, look at us, folks, we're the Army Air Corps, we're the military, we're fine about this. It's nothing to worry about. In fact, this says it well.
Yes.
We have, is this the one here?
Yeah, prank of
Okay.
nature. Yeah.
Yes. Scientists yesterday were at a loss for an explanation, a rare early admission, for some speeding through the sky by observers throughout the country, unless it was those who first observed the strange phenomena beheld a prank of nature now being perpetrated by the popular imagination. A prank of nature perpetrated by the popular imagination. Do we feel silly, Don? Oh, boy.
But yet, as you showed in the previous clipping,
Jesus.
And we've seen also photographs. There are pilots that are mounting 35 millimeter cameras on the front of their P-51 Mustang fighters. In their failed efforts to bring one of these unknown craft down, they were hoping to at least get something on film. So they are treating this clearly as a nuts and bolts invader. Something is violating our sovereign airspace, and we don't know what they are and where they're from. And we certainly don't know their intent. And so the Air Force, or I should say specifically the Army Air Corps.
Air Corps, right.
Yeah. In trying to stall for time. Because they're trying to get answers. And you have the media nipping at their ankles. You have professors, scientists that are saying, well, we don't have access to the data, so we can't make any judgment as to the true nature of the phenomena. So there's a lot of this rank speculation. Are we dealing with a new atmospheric phenomenon? Are we dealing with something as far as in nature that we're not aware of up to this point? Are we dealing with Soviet technology of recovered Nazi, German technology post-World War II? So there was a lot of rank speculation. But we need to point this out, Peter, to your audience, that there were two separate newspaper pollings during that window between Arnold and just after Roswell as to what the general public thought these sightings represented. And the skeptics, again, they try to do the same old War of the Worlds, that there was a panic and overreaction. We thought we were being invaded. No, only 2% of the American public polled at that time thought that we were dealing with an intelligence off the planet. 2%. 98% of the public accepted that we were dealing with something that was indigenous to the planet. Please, I mean, again, you're preying off of the ignorance of the public who just believe the last thing they've heard. We're talking, you and I, this whole show, we're talking stats, we're talking historic fact, we're talking about that which will stand in any court of law, because it is the truth. They are the facts.
One of the reasons I was holding that piece, and I'm going to bring it back in a moment, is just a clip reference that the undercurrent of it is, relax, folks. If the chief of the Army Air Corps is not perturbed about this, you shouldn't be either. And it comes, no, it's, here we go. Speaking about Carl Spaatz, who would have been the head of the Army Air Forces.
That's correct.
Was in the Pacific Northwest.
That's right. During the time of the Roswell incident, he was fishing. He was on a vacation. He was right there.
He denied knowing anything about the flying discs or of plans to use the AFF planes to look for them. Quote unquote, I've been out of touch with things for the past 4 or 5 days, end quote, he said. He then went to Medford, Oregon on a fishing trip, end quote. So rest easy, America. But in the meantime, we have this one individual who is now a center of attention, and it's building. You know, the whole thing.
Yes.
This man has become not a national, but an international celebrity icon, and he moves quite quickly to write it all out in a way that actually is very good.
Yes.
It's, I guess, well, certainly the first UFO book of the modern era of UFOs, and it came out I think it was the end of 47, or was we already in early 48?
I'm thinking beginning of 48. You're talking about Palmer Press as far as the coming of the saucers. Yeah, Ray Palmer, right.
And again, interest was so mixed and so intrigued. Everybody either had a curiosity or an attitude about it. It spawned the birth of a brand new magazine in 1948, which is still, bless its heart, is still with us. And the very first issue of that magazine.
Correct, right.
There you go. I can only imagine, and you know, you've spent time speaking with Kenneth Arnold's daughter. We
Kim,
both spent time speaking with.
I met with Kim on 2 occasions, and then a granddaughter as well. I can't.
Chanel. Yep.
And we were even talking about, and I was searching for what I had as far as contact information from the last contact I had with Kim. Now is almost 10 years ago.
Oh my!
And so I was unable to find. I couldn't even tell you if she was still with us. But
I'm sure. Well, if she is, I hope she is. You can certainly contact her through Chanel, who I stay in touch with and who was a guest on the show I think, well, certainly once or twice,
Right.
who republished her grandfather's
Mhm.
book in an expanded edition that is particularly valuable, I think, because it includes so much minutia, and images that are in static black and white
Mhm.
are scanned in their original faded color, things like that, documentation. But
Right. Right.
of course, the original edition is somewhat of a collectible, but this book is in print and you
Mhm.
can pick up a copy of it. And gosh, I mean, it's such an essentially unique and valuable book in anybody's UFO related library. Uh, we have here, of course, a shot of Arnold himself with his rendition. Um, I'm going to kind of jump out of sequence here for a moment, John. At a certain point, well, of course, there were theories galore about what this might be as opposed to what it might be. And at a certain point, more in what we'll laughingly call more modern times ufologically, a number of arguments have been put forward, often with a quirky assemblage of evidences or alleged evidences to create the idea that it was an advanced craft, but it was ours,
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
there were possibly actual human beings or monkeys or individuals
Pilot
who
effect.
suffered from the that terrible aging disease that distorts the head and makes you look more. Well, anyway, I mean, it's just macabre and rather
Mhm.
quite ghoulish and very paperclip. But a number of people, well, it's a wonderful world of conspiracy. Take your pick. But you are. What are your thoughts on that argument? And some have presented it in a fairly scholarly way, but it never fully comes together for me, to put it mildly. Your thoughts on that argument? Of course, we can understand why people might want to make it, and the political timing and the integration of certain odious German individuals from former intelligence who became part of the core of our intelligence community and, deals with the devil. What can you say? Your thoughts on that idea and any reflections on it?
Well, Arnold. I mean, clearly felt that these were under intelligent control. That this was not just these weren't just random objects that just happened to be passing as far as in within his eyeshot, that type of thing. And as a result, and as I mentioned earlier, that he wrestled, I mean, with the idea that as a pilot, that he could not see wings, tail section, any form of
Yeah.
propulsion. They weren't leaving any contrails. Um, and all of that in itself, getting back to what Maccabee said, that it was almost miraculous, and that back in 1947, that you had objects that, as we certainly, even by today's standards, where would be the lift characteristics of these aircraft? What would be the stabilizer as far as that you could, as far as maneuver and turn left or right or descend or ascend, what have you? I mean, we still are governed as far as within our atmosphere, as far as, by the laws of physics. And unless you want to propose that we were already experimenting with anti-gravity, we may have been, but the idea that you had already, that we had craft that were superior to both rockets and jet propulsion, which we again were first experimenting with back at that time. Most of our aircraft were still propeller, were engine propelled. And so the onus would clearly fall on the part of the government. Well, then certainly the statute of classification has long exceeded any need for security, for any secrecy. If you had aircraft back in 1947 that not only appeared by the way Arnold described them and were able to fly at that excessive speed at 1,000 miles an hour faster than anything we
Hmm.
had in the air ourselves at that time, then why are you withholding that? I mean, that's 77 years ago. What's the big secret? Except the big secret is the fact that they don't know what they were either. They have no idea, and they weren't ours. It comes
You
down to
bring
that.
up such an important point, Don. I don't know at what point in my basic old school American education, maybe late elementary school, maybe early junior high school, when you understand at that moment in time that there was this war and there's a necessity for keeping secrets from the enemy. And
Totally.
the only thing that really came up in popular culture or deductive education was, well, it's got to be about atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs and keeping those secrets. And I think, in a way, the myth of the birth and growth of our national security state and parallel national security states around the world begins with that effort to protect our nuclear secrets from the communists, when in reality, that was a dodge. And the way I've often discussed it is, you're an oyster. A piece of sand gets in your area. It's irritating. You're a soft, squishy thing. You start to create this substance, and it becomes, there are fewer, sharper and sharper edges on that piece of sand. You keep building it until it's nice and round and nothing will penetrate. That's a pearl. That piece of sand inside that pearl of our national security state is the secret.
Yes.
But it's always been discussed in terms of national security, when in fact we're beginning with a bunch of men who have achieved a certain level of success in military, industry, intelligence, psychology, people who are distinguished enough that a president might want to consult them. And they're at a moment in history when everybody is looking to America, the American government, the American military, including ourselves, as, gosh, just the greatest thing since sliced bread, an expression I've never really fully understood, and I don't want to go off on a tangent about it, but that sense of it's as good as it gets, when in reality, we are terrified. Not even necessarily that we're not alone in the universe, but that my position as the head mucky muck of such and such an office or agency is now threatened with the possibility that I don't know what the hell I'm doing. And we are powerless against these things, whatever the hell they are. It's a sense, really, and the power of language. From the beginning, we were talking about national insecurity.
Right.
And that we wouldn't look like hard guys, that we'd be just like everybody else, lost in awe of a much greater presence than the winners of World War II. And I think that threat to the ego of people in extraordinary power, those who have always moved the chess pieces around, those who determine certain events. And I'm not a conspiracist per se, but you'd be naive to think that history wasn't in great part defined by secret agreements between people, usually for nefarious purposes. And again, the myth of the birth of the national security state, except when you study it, and you and I and so many other individuals who find their way into the work realize that for themselves, and all of a sudden it's the emperor's new clothes. We're seeing the evolution of the last 77 years from a particularly different facet of the diamond, and everything looks different as a result.
It does. And in the sense that, in as much as you and I have become not believers in so much as that we are convinced that we are not alone, we are being visited, but the point being, it changes everything. But it also changes everything, as you just described, as far as from their vantage point. Because just imagine, even back at that time, if they conceded publicly that we are not alone, we are being visited, who first of all makes that announcement? Can you imagine? Who makes that announcement? Who goes before the American public and go, ladies and gentlemen, I sit before you here in the Oval Office to tell you that we have visitors of a higher intellect We don't know where they're from.
Harry S. Truman, ideally.
And the point is, they're able to fly through our airspace with total impunity. We don't know where they're from. We don't know who they are. We don't know what their intentions are. But vote for me come next election. I mean, who's going to, ever,
Bingo.
speak out about something that, in my case, I still remain convinced that it's a cover-up of ignorance, that they still don't have any answers. They are still dealing with something that they cannot bridge that technology. They can't find that on button. But even if we go back, Peter, quickly, even chronologically, within 2 months after the Arnold sighting, within 2 months after Roswell, you have General George Shulgin, who had that letter from the FBI. We like an estimate of the situation. We like an assessment of what what's going on. Our field agents, are actively, tracking down witnesses, and they're not tracking down witnesses to hallucinations. They realize they're dealing again with hardware. Something is in our airspace, and again, we have no answers. So, Shulgin then makes that request as far as to the head of Air Material Command, which was General Nathan Twining.
Right.
Twining would sign off on that famous Twining letter, where they actually, in September of 1947, they conceded that the phenomenon was real and not visionary or fictitious. Precisely. So right there, that is a slam dunk against the media. That's a slam dunk. Right. In other words, it's real. It's
September 1947.
Precisely.
Do you ever wonder? I don't think it's possible to wonder. Let's just say Harry S. Truman, a tough son of a bitch and an independent character once he became president, if he had bucked the system, and I fully believe that the advisors he pulled together, whatever we want to call them, once they began to study it, they realized, number one, they were completely out of their depth and they'd never be in their depth. Number two, if they wanted to keep their cushy job and that incredible ego booster of being in the inner cabal of the greatest secret in the history of civilization, they'd lose that if this became public. The world would be chaos. Who knew what was going to happen? But let's just say Truman, who I believe, for good or bad, took their advice and continued to study, and the thing became that giant pearl that, now is, who knows where that piece of sand is. If he had gone on television, maybe even contacting and encouraging other world leaders, including Stalin, to make broadcasts at the same moment to their people, my fellow Americans, it's my solemn duty, blah, 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 how differently our world would have evolved, for better or worse. I can't even begin to imagine not having that from 1947 on, this huge lie dividing the world into sleepwalkers and Kevin McCarthy's from Invasion of the Body Snatchers stepping into the highway screaming, "They're here, ready, you're next."
Yeah. And you raise an excellent point, Peter. The idea that we've been living a lie for the last 77 years. We have been deceived. We have been living as far as under this element of national security, which is often a cop-out. I mean, it's their fallback for most everything they just don't want to tell us about. But yet, the sightings that were taking place at that time, that not only did it necessitate General Twining to sign off on that assessment of what was actually happening, but then the recommendation that there would be a actual investigation of the phenomenon, which then General Lawrence Craigie, who was involved at Roswell, and then the fact that he then recommended, which became 2 points below top secret, but nonetheless, Project Sign, Project Saucer, as it was also nicknamed. So there was an official investigation of this silly season that the media, again, thinking that they sat there in judgment of all events, from the safety of their newsrooms. And reality still being what it was, the Air Force at that time, they had to actually wrestle with the situation. What are we dealing with here?
And that is where we're going to have to hold until our break. Stay with us. Don Schmitt, Peter Robbins, meanwhile here on Earth. Back shortly.
The UNX Network presents a health and wellness spiritually based brand of hemp-derived CBD products made by Hopewell Farm in Harrogate, Tennessee. We apply our Cathara energy work with all of our plants and products. Our products made in small batches with only 2 ingredients of pure hemp, full-spectrum crude oil, and coconut-derived MCT oil. Third-party lab tested for potency and legal THC levels with 6 strengths of 1 ounce oil to choose from. Know what you're buying and get what you pay for from Hopewell Farm. Applied directly to a specific area, Hopewell Farm topical salve in 1 ounce and ½ ounce sizes made with pure hemp crude oil, comfrey extract, and all natural ingredients. Find the Hopewell Farm link and coupon code on the UNX Network website at unxnetwork.com. That's unxnetwork.com. This September 6th through the 13th, join with like-minded souls in the experience of a lifetime on the Royal Caribbean Ovation of the Seas as we travel from Seattle to Alaska. Internationally renowned researchers, investigators, experiencers, authors, holistic healers, contactees, spiritual luminaries will sail on an extraordinary voyage of transformation. This cruise will explore UFOs, alien contact, cover-ups, ancient mysteries, the paranormal, holistic healing, and spirituality. Experience engaging lectures, one-on-one sessions, private, custom-tailored excursions, and a nightly UFO watch. The cruise is booking up fast. Go to contactatsea.com and be sure to mention the UNX Network when you book. That's contactatsea.com or phone 336-749-1219. That's 336-749-1219.
This is Margie Kay, and I'd like to say thank you to all of our KUNX show hosts, staff, listeners, and viewers for making us #1 on Paranormal Talk Radio.
And we're back. Peter Robbins here. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth. My special guest on this 77th anniversary of the Kenneth Arnold sighting and ostensibly the birth of the modern age of UFOs, my friend and colleague, Donald R. Schmitt. Hi, Don. I hope you had a lovely break.
Yes, I was actually doing a little work on the side, so I have another book due. I have another book due by August, so
I had a sandwich and a nap.
Oh my God, what's that?
To pick up where we left off, people, what one person accepts for evidence is not acceptable to the next person over, because you and I, because you have been so focused on Roswell and everything it entails for so many years. You really are a repository of hard evidence regarding the case. And for me, one of the most jaw-dropping, most exciting breaks in the entire Roswell story had to do with an advance in photo analysis and optics.
Yes.
In 1947, professional photographers working for news agencies and the like used a camera made by a company called Graflex.
Correct.
It's often, you see it in noir movies. They're big hunkin' apparatuses, 5x5 prints. The resolution is superb. And during the incredibly humiliating balloon posings that poor Jesse Marcel Sr., really one of the greatest American heroes in terms of what the man suffered for just being at the wrong place at the right moment and having the onus put on him, was a series of photographs of the so-called mogul weather balloon that he mistook for countless number of pieces in a debris field made of real metal from a crashed object from who knows where. The photographer who took the pictures, total professional, working in news agencies for some years at that time, but a source of gentle humor, because well before James Bond was even a gleam in the eye of the author, James Bond Johnson.
Correct.
Took the photos that we're all familiar with. After I'm sure Marcel was excused, the photo session went on. And two of the photos from that session, well, here's one. And you see a circle drawn around General Ramey's left hand. And he's holding something in his hand, whatever the heck it is. And of course, this is a very poor scan of a very good photograph. This is another one of the photos. We see him holding that thing in his hand. You can talk to us a bit about how this came up and the extraordinary process by which we were able, this cablegram telex in the hand of General Ramey was deciphered. And we go from this, and please understand, everything I'm showing you right now.
Keep that picture there for a second.
Yes.
People. If you notice General Ramey's thumb.
Yes.
Look at the nail.
Yep.
It's got a bad tear in the thumbnail.
Yeah. And that first of all, you're kind of digressing for a moment, but it demonstrated how quickly this all came together. So much so that not only in shredding up that kite, that radar reflector kite, and getting it all set for Johnson to come in and take the pictures, he tears his fingernail. He still has his cap on. He still has his tie on. It's his office. It's his office. He's the one who staged the press conference. But things came together a little quicker than they had anticipated.
the fact that Ramey is in 4 of the pictures holding up that piece of paper. In 3 of them, it's the back side of the paper, the blank side. In only this particular shot is this text of this paragraph of text visible. So it's like he caught himself, or was it his chief of staff, Thomas DuBose, Colonel Thomas DuBose, who said, "General, my God, look what you're holding," and he flipped the page for the subsequent 3 shots. So in a court of law, that's how you would, present all this. Let's look at the evidence, in front of us.
Now, even in this scan, which is of poor quality, look at the last 3-letter word of that first paragraph with the period after it. That could be FBI. If you squint ever so slightly, you will begin to see certain letter forms. That understood. Let's go to the next level here. Once again, you're seeing this as clearly as we are on your screen. Squint ever so slightly. You see certain letter forms become clearer, others don't. Then we jump to this, and this is where I gasped.
This is from Dr. David Rudiak. Yes.
Now,
victims of the wreck you forwarded to the blank blank at Fort Worth, Texas. Balloons do not have pilots. End of debate.
Incredible. And check this. Now, I want to ask everybody here again. You are seeing how these letter forms were recovered, again, without any special equipment. Just squint your eyes. You'll see most of it come right through, damn it. It's, for me, using a scientific tool like advanced photo analysis, taking it step by step. The evidence chain is unbroken. It's unassailable. Of course, in a sense, the same way that the Twining document from September 1947, when it was quietly declassified, had it been discovered by a lead reporter for a major news organization rather than a UFO researcher, would it have been put on the front page of major newspapers and broadcasts? Probably not. But for people that talk about a lack of evidence, for starters, how do you get around this? Does it get any better in terms of the real world?
Right. Because in as much as they buried their tracks, in as much as they may have anticipated future, investigation, those who've suggested that. Now, why would the general in eyeshot of a camera, have even been holding that piece of paper? Now, again, remember where I said that this all came together rather quickly. General Ramey enters his office. He's holding that telex as though it was just handed him, as though he just, received it. And in the 3 subsequent shots, it's the reverse back blank side of the paper. So he caught himself. He changed it. He took it out of as far as the camera view.
Yeah.
Now, in 1990, when we first learned that the original negatives were still available, they still existed. And already at that time, we were contemplating, what if we were to do computer enhancement? Because every time we would blow that particular photograph up, it's like, my God, we're just on the cusp of reading this. And let's rely as far as on present technology. And it was Dr. Richard Haynes, who at the time was consulting with NASA, and dear friend of both of ours. He was working for Jet Propulsion Laboratory as far as in the San Francisco area, Pasadena area, that type of thing. And Richard was only able to come up with a few letters. And it was in the final 2 lines of the telex where the the words weather balloon are clearly available. So it would be further down on the telex. It'd be to the bottom. So weather balloons. Okay, so we thought it was a press release for the weather balloon press conference. So we assumed that for years. And then as Adobe and others actually created programs that could not only enhance, but also digitize and pixel edge and separate the noise factor, because the problem we had with the enhancement was that as we increased the level of the image, we were also increasing the grain effect, the noise factor. And who I had even consulted with originally was Ray Downing at Studio Macbeth in New York. And we had wonderful conversations because I saw that they had the same problem when the History Channel had contracted Ray to do the 3D imagery of the Shroud of Turin, the alleged burial cloth of Jesus Christ. And they had the same problem that as they intensified, they increased the image level, they increased the level of the fabric, the weave, the noise. And Ray was describing to me how they created a program that, like layers of an onion, it shaved away that noise element because there was a pattern of the fabric, that it was able to separate the two. And that all you were left with at the end was the actual image of the figure on the fabric. We were hoping we could do the same thing with the Ramey memo, with this telex, that if we could shave away the noise, the grain, we'd be left with nothing but the letters. Now, we realize we're at the pinnacle right now. That I know there's a new book that just came out, and he has an entirely different interpretation on the memo. Positive in our respect, that he even claims that the word ET or the acronym ET is there. It would not have been used back in 47. Even expression, no. And even the word alien, they weren't using alien.
That's right.
The word victim is much more apropos. Not only if you were to look at all military/government documents, whenever they refer to as far as bodies of either military or civilian, they use the word casualties. The fact that they use the word victims, in other words, they're qualifying it. And then the word disc is also used twice within the memo, and it's in quotation marks, as though they're also qualifying that. Okay, you see it at the top.
Yeah.
Right. That's the one time, and then there was another area that was also used. Yeah. So in quotes, why? Because it wasn't disc shape. So again, those are the type of things that we wrestle with. But as I mentioned, that we are issuing this challenge to the skeptics. We believe that now is the time that we would have AI interpret the memo once and for all. No human involvement, just let artificial intelligence read the memo. And that we would be willing to accept the final outcome, provided they would. Whatever it is, it'll be the last word. And so that's going to be the next phase in all this.
You know, you remind me, it's just a footnote, but in 1947, as I learned in a number of searches in the New York Times newspaper morgue, with great frustration, looking for the word extraterrestrial as well as spaceship, I found neither. And ultimately, I discovered why, because I found that in references using those words in 47, it was always written out space ship and
Right.
extraterrestrial,
Yes.
just the way it was back then.
Right.
Don, you, more than most better known individuals in the world of UFO studies, at a certain point decided to zero in and specialize in a particular incident, Roswell, as opposed to being more of a generalist or, kind of a journeyman, so to say, and investigate different cases. What was it? Was there a particular thing or moment or awareness or
An
evidence?
epiphany. Right. I think, Peter, first of all, it was because we were, and I'm speaking of Kevin D. Randall, who was my first partner and the first co-author and the first two books we did on Roswell. And when we were preparing to make that first weekend jaunt down to the land of enchantment, New Mexico, we were skeptics. We were so convinced that we would come away proving that this was indeed nothing more than a balloon device of any sort.
Good.
Or something just as prosaic. And I don't believe that most researchers could make such a claim. I think not that they would have a preconceived, conclusion, but they may be biased one way or the other.
I want to believe.
Yeah, the skeptics have the same dilemma. I should say that the scoffers, the debunkers, the want not to believe. The conviction that it can't be, therefore it isn't.
Debunkers,
so
not skeptics.
We went into this as genuine as you would like any judge, any jury to actually look into a situation. And it was during that first trip and that we are listing the first-hand witnesses describe the wreckage to us. One by one, they are describing the extraordinary characteristics of this metal-like material. And especially when they started to describe the memory material, that it was nearly indestructible, but yet you could crease it, you could fold it, you could crumble it into a ball, and each and every time you'd place it down, it would unfurl, it would unravel, it would flow like water as it would return to its original shape and size. And you're going, well, that certainly is not a balloon. That's not a plane. It's not a rocket. It's not anything that we've ever heard of, and especially by 1947 standards. What else could it be except what the eyewitnesses are telling us? So then it becomes this race with the Undertaker, as you've often heard, and our dear friend Stanton Friedman described the race with the Undertaker, because we need to get all these people on the record. We need to develop a level of consistency. Because if they're truly talking about something profound, no different than all the people who were witness to the Kennedy assassination, all of us who just heard that first, as far as special report that came from Dallas, Texas, about the president being shot, we will for the rest of our lives know exactly where we were, what we were doing, and what our first thoughts were at that moment. And we weren't in Dealey Plaza. And so the thought being that with Roswell, that the genuine witnesses for, again, holding something that extraordinary in their hands, they would never forget. It would be as vivid as the moment they first experienced that. And in describing, such, an experience in their lives, to me, that was it was beyond just, okay, we need to maybe reconsider this. We need to start, evaluating our premise and that maybe this is something beyond the pale. It was like, oh my God, if these people are telling us the truth, we are dealing with the biggest UFO case of all time, because you're talking about the actual recovery, the retrieval of wreckage, materials, physical evidence, and remains, bodies.
Don, I know you don't have an exact number, and I know you don't exaggerate, But beginning in 1990, working with Kevin Randall, and then working with your current writing partner, the great Tom Carey, you and your partners interviewed a shockingly large number of extremely responsible adults.
Over 600.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but not one of whom expressed the desire for notoriety,
Correct.
to make money on this, to write their own book, to become any kind of personality. They just wanted to be on record while they were alive.
And even that was not the case, Peter. We had to not only track them down, not only did we have
win their trust.
Well, we had to win their trust, because their typical reaction was, how did you find me? Who told you about me? And I have nothing to say. It was over, the course of weeks and months, and in many cases, years, before we would finally get them to confide to us. And then, with concern of government reprisal, loss of pension benefits, and safety of their own families, there was a commonality, there was a pattern that went beyond just their disclosure of something of this magnitude. It was also the human element, the fact that they lived with that. It was something that weighed on them on a daily basis. And then it was not only cathartic, it was a release that they finally were able to go on the record. But then, am I now going to regret for the rest of my life that I uttered one word about something that I was threatened and I was warned, should I ever say anything about this, not only myself, but my wife, my children, my grandchildren would all be in jeopardy. Now just imagine. It's one thing if we would have had just one witness that would, describe such an outlandish, extreme reaction to something as mundane as an off-the-shelf weather balloon, rubber, foil, wooden sticks, string, and tape. And they're threatening to kill my children over that. Yeah. Juxtaposed to something that is, again, so out of this world that it was the only way the government could contain it, by threatening people into silence, into submission. And it worked.
While you're talking, I'm thinking, number one, in the spirit of what constitutes evidence, reasonable skeptics often will put forward, and certainly debunkers, that this is completely circumstantial evidence, and then cite the tired old example of, if there's a car accident and you happen to be seeing it at that moment it happens, or you turn when you hear the crash, everybody involved will have a different memory, different details. It's partly a function of shock, point of view, predisposition, but I know that feeling of returning to a location to develop a reputation that ultimately somebody will come forward years later and say, I've been keeping an eye on you informally on a certain level, and you've won my confidence enough for me to add my memory of, in this case, the Rendlesham Forest incident as a civilian. Yes. That feeling of winning the trust of a witness is very good. Yes. At the same time,
great feeling. Yeah.
We were talking before about we're not believers, but the phrase that I'm most comfortable using is people like us no longer have the luxury of disbelief. The preponderance of evidence, as though we were specialty attorneys, piling up, in our files, is beyond any reasonable doubt by a legal standard. However, for people listening for the last couple of minutes or watching who really have no genuine sense of your history, your years in the work, the respect that we hold for you, here's you saying, they threatened to kill my kids. They threatened to kill me. And it's like, whoa, hold it, Nellie. You got me up until now, but this is starting to sound little. We're talking here, not about 1, not about 5, not about 10, but many, many individuals who not only made that almost identical report, but then in that next wave of research years later, which still holds my attention in a way that very little in the genuine witness-driven, if circumstantial area for me is a gold standard.
Mm-hmm.
The preponderance of these accounts. And if you listen to recordings as opposed, you capture them very well with Tom in your the initial book and the updated book of Children of Roswell. And that reminds me, I need to get a copy of the updated edition next week. I read part of that in Galleys. You sent it to me. We're honored in a way that people do that sometimes. They ask for your opinion on a work not published. At a certain point in your career, it starts to happen occasionally, and I always take it as a compliment and a responsibility. Absolutely. But the accounts of these people who were 12 years old at the time, who, when you got them, were in their 70s and 80s, almost all or all of whom are gone now. I've rarely had as heartbreaking, enraging, and fascinating a reading experience, one after another. And then, of course, back in the day, not that many years ago, when a number of these extraordinarily decent, courageous, very senior citizens joined us on stage with audiences of hundreds of people, and they told their accounts.
Yes.
Or quietly, at a moment during the conference when most people are in listening to a lecture. And you've got, I'm trying to remember the name of the witness, but he was on the flight to 8th Army headquarters.
That would have been Sergeant Arthur Osachuk, who was on the July 9th flight. That was the second body flight.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but he lived with his adult son, and his son had learned about the event, contacted you, and they came to Roswell.
Correct.
And I got to sit with him and you and hear him tell the account that I'm sure he told a number of times before, but as though it were new. And what was the name of that dear woman who?
Frankie Rowe.
I'm not even going to try to characterize.
Fire crew chief Dan Dwyer. Correct.
Let's talk about Frankie right now. When did she pass?
Oh, it will be 5-6 years ago. In fact, she would always come to festival. And in the latter part of her life, after her husband James had died, they had lived up in Portales, about an hour northeast of Roswell. And after James had died, she moved back to Roswell, and she had a mini ranch that she maintained by herself. And she then, just religiously, every time we were in Roswell, we made sure that we not only visited, but that she would join us for our dinner get-togethers and things. And so, dear lady. And then,
I will never forget her.
Yeah.
And I remember when you first, it was before you introduced me, because she was already up on the stage and thinking, wonderful bone structure. She's really wonderfully dressed. She had a couple of really beautiful pieces of Navajo jewelry, nothing ostentatious, obviously a woman of some real taste, and a face that told you that she was stunning when she was young.
Yes.
And her story, it's a variation on the story that so many people told you, but in this case, it had a twist that, if you're going to make a screenplay out of this, you couldn't make up a detail like this and have people say, yeah, right, that happened. It has to do with the man who, well, the MP who was under orders to frighten the hell out of her, and the son of that MP. Can you take it from there and tell us Frankie's
Yeah,
story
yeah,
and the coda at the end? I want
yeah.
people to hear this from you.
This was after Frankie. She had gone to the dentist. She had had her tonsils removed days before, so she was doing a follow-up
She's
exam.
about 12 years old at this point.
That's correct. And she stops by the firehouse, visit with her dad. Well, he's not available because he's out at the crash site with another fireman by the name of Ed Reeves. They're going because they heard what had crashed north of town. So they drove out in one of their own personal vehicles. So there was a state police officer by the name of Robert Scroggins who worked Lincoln County, which is where the debris field is located, that the rancher, Mac Brazel, reported, and then he notifies the police department, the sheriff's department, who then in turn notifies Major Marcel, head of intelligence of the 509th at the Roswell Army Airfield, and that was just the beginning of everything. Well, anyway, Scroggins lived east of Roswell, so Brazel had given him a piece of the memory material that should he pass through Roswell, he should show it around and see if anyone can identify this strange, metal-like material. So Frankie is at the firehouse when this arrival, and she gets to handle this piece of memory material. And so she describes it even up to the time she died as though it just happened that afternoon. Because as she would describe it, it was like quicksilver. It was like water flowing between her fingers as she would release her grip. And watching one man after the other, and these are all experienced, trained firemen, and they're all in awe. They're aghast at what is this? What does this represent? That type of thing. So it would be a day or two later that once again her dad is at the firehouse. There's a knock at the door. Mother answers, and she immediately tells Frankie and her sister, Dorothy, to go to the bedroom. And it was First Lieutenant Arthur Philbin, who was in charge of base security, and 3 non-commissioned officers. And there was some loud discussion out in the kitchen. And the next thing, there's not a rap on the bedroom door. He just walks in. And Philbin was a 20-year New York State police officer, 6'4", 250 pounds, John Wayne, and he's got a baton. And Frankie would describe how he kept. And Frankie, if you ever say another word about what you saw, what you heard, or what you held in your hands, we will take you out into the desert, and they will never even find your bones, that type of thing. So we failed in trying to find Philbin because he had died like 70, 71 already. So just 23, 24 years later. But I get a call from Frankie while she's still living in Roswell. Now she's a widow. And she goes, Don, I think I did something really, really foolish. I had a phone call from a gentleman who said he was passing through New Mexico back to Arizona, and he wanted to know if he could visit with me. And for whatever reason, I said, I'll be here. Stop by. And it's like, oh my God, Don, I don't know if I should leave. I said, well, okay, you have a number of options. You could just not be there, just go into town and have dinner. Or you could report it to the police, that at least they would be in the neighborhood. Or third, let's see who it is. Let's see who it is. And Frankie would tell me yet later that evening that she chose the latter. She stayed. Gentleman arrived. She very coyly, very reluctantly went to the door, and there was a gentleman standing. And he introduced himself, and he very, very humbly said, if my father were alive, he would want you to have these. And he reached from behind his back and he presented her with a bouquet of flowers. It was James.
Did she know who he
Philbin.
was yet?
No. And then he introduced himself. My name is James Philbin. It was my father who had paid you that terrifying visit here back in 1947. And he was following orders. I hope you understand that he would not have harmed a hair on your head if not following orders. But he would want, and then they hugged one another. They both cried together. And we wanted to recreate this. We wanted to do it at one of the festivals as an act of, of symbolism of the military,
Yes.
asking for forgiveness of all the civilians involved. And then have James once again publicly present Frankie with a bouquet of flowers. Disclosure. And never happened. We just couldn't bring it all together. We had talked about Frankie was willing to do it. James Philbin was willing to do it. And then Frankie would die just a few years thereafter. But what a wonderful, symbol of not only the son acknowledging that, yeah, my dad did that.
Yes.
My dad threatened to kill you over what
12 years old.
Right.
12 years old.
Yeah. And, but this was my way of, and his way of saying, if my father were still alive, he would want you to have these. Now, how does a scoffer, even deal with that? A debunker? They would just say, "Well, never happened."
Right. You're not telling the truth.
Yeah, that's how they deal with the human element in all of this. They're not telling the truth. Well, that speaks more of them, doesn't it? Because in as much as they have become cynics, and as much as they suspect everyone, I guess I would turn that around. Well, I suspect you. Because you're just transferring, your thought processes. You're just demonstrating that because you don't trust anybody, it's because you can't be trusted in any situation. It takes one to know one. Sorry. To me, that's all.
No, it's a point well made. And again, people in normal courts of law around the world are sometimes convicted of capital offenses on witness testimony. I don't know about you. I've served on 4 juries in my time, all New York State Supreme Court juries.
Not one. No.
In New York City, all when I was younger. And you go in that jury room and you evaluate the evidence. We all have jury rooms inside of ourselves. I think part of the problem that a rational skeptic might have reading this series of books, they bring up so much damn emotion.
Yeah.
And that's something a lot of people are uncomfortable with. It's easier on the psyche, to say, if you're involved in UFO research, to stick with the stats, to, I'm not going to say dehumanize, but that's the word that I often immediately comes to mind when I use the word case. Perfectly realistic word, but we use that word and it can often encapsulate the most beatific or terrifying, the most life-changing or paradigm-shifting event in a person's life. And when you line up these dozens and dozens and dozens and hundreds of cases, and you ultimately begin to realize, shit, none of these people, I can't find an angle to come at them unless it's some kind of, mass collective desire to live in the, all the nonsensical psychological innuendo, as opposed to these several hundred people are telling the truth as they know it. For any of you that want to really get closer to this, for me, again, you've got a zillion wonderful documentaries. There are great films, but the reading experience is essential. If you want to really make contact with serious research and investigation, and in you're publishing history, and I'm not showing all of them by you and Don or by you and Tom, but this is essential reading. And for me, no more than Witness to Roswell and The Children of Roswell. It's that feeling that you get when you're engaged with somebody who, oh, you're Donald Schmitt, you're a famous UFO researcher. Can you prove that to me here? It's like you want to bitch slap somebody. I've been working for decades. Why don't you read a couple of my books and let's come back in several months and chat about what you've read. And you make notes on where specifically you have problems or issues. It's a cop-out.
Wonderful example of that would be, Peter, was, and he was the provost marshal at the Roswell Army Airfield in 1947. He was Major Edwin Easley. So in other words, he was in charge of the 1393rd MP unit. So he was in charge of the security at the time of the recovery operation, the checkpoints, who was allowed in, who drove in, that type of thing. He was in charge of all that. And when Kevin first interviewed him in 1990, and we have him on tape stating over and over and over again, I can't talk about that. I am still sworn to secrecy. No matter what we asked him, I am still sworn to secrecy. Now, mind you, that's 43 years after the incident. Okay. So he agreed that we could send him a copy of our first book.
Oh, good.
Which we did. And he assured us he would even give it a perusal. He'd take a look. So months later, we were down at the Center for UFO Studies in Chicago. We were at the office, and we just thought, hey, we're together here. Let's give the colonel, he was at that time a retired lieutenant colonel, let's give Colonel Easley a phone call and get his reaction on the book. So we're talking to him. And again, he's just being very coy. He's not volunteering anything. And then we finally pointed out, well, Colonel, you see which direction the witnesses are taking us. Can you at least tell us if we're going in the right direction? And there was a slight pause, and then he came back and he responds, let's just say you're not going in the wrong direction. So it's a classic military response. I didn't tell them anything. I didn't admit anything. It's like plausible deniability, but it was wonderful. Yeah. And the point being, so what do you, Mr. Scoffer, know that he doesn't know? Now, so what you're going to say that, well, he was just throwing you a bone. He was throwing you a crumb. He was just playing with your emotions, so to speak. But then it comes down to, as you were talking about, even participating in jury duty. And there's that classic Japanese movie, circa 1950. And it's a murder trial. And it's called the Rashomon effect. Yeah. And it's where the judge, in as far as allowing for the closing arguments, and then as far as the jury then being sequestered as far as to make a verdict. And the judge points out that there are three sides to every event, three sides to every situation. There's your side, there's your interpretation of what happened, and then there's my interpretation of what happened. And then there's what really happened. Yeah. So it comes down to who has been the most proactive, who has actually gone out and performed due diligence. It's hardly the scoffers, the debunkers. They solve everything from their keyboard, from the comfort of their armchair, the comfort of their office. I'm sorry. We've done all the archaeological digs. We've tracked down all the witnesses. We've done all the document and all the FOIA requests as far as on the paper trail. As you mentioned, Peter, we've worked on this now for over 30 years. Yeah. And the thought that we started out, again, I can't emphasize enough, we were total skeptics. And now it becomes an investigation of not only conviction, but now we are tracking down all the families that we missed with the hope that we get more and more deathbed confessions, that their fathers, their mothers made one last comment about 1947 before they passed on. And
Don, can you, to cut you off for a moment, can you share with us an incidence where one of those inquiries has come back to learn of a particularly memorable going on record for the last time before you die and passing that information on to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a perfect, extension of Colonel Edwin Easley, the provost marshal, right. And the fact that he stated over and over again to us in 1990 that he was still sworn to secrecy. So it's just 2 years later, 1992. He is dying of stomach cancer at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas. The exact hospital that John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead.
Taken to, yeah.
In the presence of Easley's two daughters, and one of them being Nancy Strickland, who was a lifetime attorney. His granddaughter came to say goodbye, but she presented him with a gift. She brought it to her grandfather, held it up to his face, and he turned away and he went, "Oh, the creatures." And he went on to, just very apologetically, I've regretted all these years that I was never able to tell you the truth about what happened back at Roswell, but it was true. It all did happen. I was asked by the president never to discuss this again. And here I lie as far as in my final hours, and it did happen. It was a paperback copy of our book. So the response that elicited was, "Oh, the creatures." Admissible in a court of law. We have over 30 deathbed confessions. So it's beyond circumstantial in that a deathbed is accepted as physical evidence. And we have over 30.
Amazing, Don. That's heroic. That is such an extraordinary affirmation of hard work and due diligence and research. We have some minutes left before we go off the air. With the benefit of hindsight, looking back almost like a time tunnel, here we are in June of 2024, looking back at the summer of 1947, and about 70 years in, making it about 7 years ago or 6.5, something happened. There's a publication of two articles in the New York Times, December 17th, 2017.
2017, right.
I don't know whether or not they triggered two very well-written articles by three outstanding journalists,
Yes.
Leslie Kane, of course, Ralph Blumenthal, and Helene Cooper, who usually doesn't get the respect she deserves.
She doesn't, right. I agree.
Or whether or not it simply happened at a moment where we were coming into a turning point. Mm-hmm. I generally refer to it as not that we're free of ridicule now, but the post-overt ridicule era.
Yes. It's no longer that taboo subject that was career threatening as it was in the past.
And in a funny way, in some ways, for some professionals, seemingly career enhancing. Attention is being drawn by them in the world of academic, in the world of universities and colleges. They are
Dr.
not
Abby
only not
Loeb,
having.
Abby
There you
Loeb,
go.
in contrast to our late dear friend, Dr. John Mack,
Right.
that they threatened to fire him as far as
Yeah.
from Harvard. And here's Abby Loeb, and it's become a springboard as far as to publicity and notoriety and even grants and funding. I mean, just imagine, can you imagine if we would have had that with Dr. Mack back in the day? So,
And it wasn't that long ago.
Oh,
It's
no.
true. And the only way that Dr. Mack was able to remain at Harvard as a distinguished professor emeritus of psychiatry was going through the same process
The legal
that
process.
the last, right, that Timothy Leary went through in the 1960s, which of course resulted in his expulsion. But, well, Timothy Leary didn't have Daniel Sheehan as an attorney.
No, he didn't have
In any
Danny
case,
as an attorney, right?
Harvard has not had a negative peep in the press or the academic world that we're aware of about having this distinguished gentleman on their faculty. And of course, in the background is, it's hopeful, but it's stage managed to a degree.
Cautiously hopeful.
What is going on in the House of Representatives? On one side, it's very gratifying to know that there are elected officials who are important politicians in this country who now take the subject so seriously that they continue to polish legislation. Of course, the process could drag on for decades if the forces that be wanted it to. I don't think it will. People think many folks see disclosure as an event, the big announcement.
Right.
There will be announcements, but as we now know, it is a organic process. It's going on right now, and the show we're doing tonight is one more little nail in the coffin.
My biggest regret, now this again, it's almost 30 years ago, when we worked with the late Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico.
May rest in peace.
We were providing, just literally over 100 firsthand witnesses, and there was the push for congressional hearings. And
90% of the Arizona public was on Representative Schiff's side. They wanted to see results.
Absolutely, all the way to the governor, Bill Richardson of New Mexico, and so what could have happened, but he did not elicit as far as support on Capitol Hill. That was the saddest aspect, and unfortunately, should it have happened during the Clinton administration, I think it would have, been a little bit more forthright, and it wasn't. And so we can only look back and, well, why did it fail back then? And yet Roswell is not even on the table this time around. And yet you have hatchet jobs by Garrett Grafe, who's a Pulitzer nominee as far as he does a whole chapter attacking Roswell, and then News Nation, which has been very pro UFO in general, but they also did a hatchet job that Roswell has all been explained away as Project Mogul, this Russian spy balloon, and even Mogul was summarily dismissed even 30 years ago because even their very flight log doesn't correspond to the very flight launch of the balloon that they purported to be. So again, it's a non-starter. It's a non-secular. I mean, please, you haven't done your homework.
Yeah.
So it's like, as I reminded, and I told Congressman Tim Burchett the one time we talked, I said, you have to stop asking for documents. It's like the scene in Independence Day with the president. Why wasn't I shown this? All you have to do is, we want to see the wreckage. If we're going to believe David Grush as a whistleblower and that they have recovered physical evidence, I don't want to see photographs. I don't want to see film. I don't want to see documents. I want to see the proof.
On that note, Donald R. Schmitt, Don, my dear friend, a pleasure spending this time with you. We are out of time. Peter Robbins here.
Very good. Uh-huh.
Happy anniversary, the Arnold family.
Yes, absolutely.
Don, you and I will see each other next week, and I am so looking forward to that. Folks, come if you can, July 7th to July 5th through the 7th.
Correct.
Website at the International UFO Museum and Research Center. Stay well, stand up for what you believe in, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Peter.